Forget supply and demand. Forget market equilibrium. In certain corners of the world, the real invisible hand of the market isn't Adam Smith's benevolent guide. It's a calloused, grasping hand, eager to take its cut. This isn't just about politicians pocketing bribes. This is about an entire parallel economic system, a shadow GDP, where every transaction, every permit, every tender has a silent, unwritten surcharge. A surcharge so pervasive, it often makes the official economy look like a quaint hobby. Welcome to the ultimate hostile takeover, a market where the product is power, the currency is compromise, and the shareholders are rarely accountable. We're not talking about petty theft or isolated incidents here. We're discussing a sophisticated, often highly organized enterprise, complete with its own supply chains, distribution networks, and even research and development. It's a business model perfected over centuries, refined through countless iterations, thriving in the murky waters where public service meets private greed. Imagine a corporation whose primary objective isn't innovation or customer satisfaction, but the systematic extraction of wealth through systemic manipulation. Its employees, from the lowest clerk to the highest minister, understand the unwritten rules of engagement. They know the profit margins, the risk assessments, and the unspoken incentive structures better than any official policy manual. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature, meticulously coded into the very operating system of nations. The core product of this market is access. Access to contracts, access to resources, access to justice, or perhaps more accurately, access to the lack of justice for those who can afford it. Think of it as a premium subscription service where the price is determined not by market value but by perceived leverage and the desperation of the client. Want a building permit fast-tracked? There's a fee. Need a competitor's license revoked? That's a higher tier. Looking to make a problematic lawsuit disappear? Congratulations, you've just entered the Platinum Club. This shadow economy generates staggering revenues. Estimates suggest that corruption costs the global economy trillions of dollars annually. But unlike legitimate businesses, this money rarely circulates back into productive investments. It's hoarded, laundered, and often spirited away to offshore accounts, further distorting legitimate financial markets. It's an extractive industry in the purest sense, sucking resources out of the public domain and into private illicit coffers. The beauty, from a purely cynical business perspective, is its incredible resilience. Traditional economic downturns rarely impact it. In fact, crises often present new opportunities. Desperation fuels demand, and scarcity inflates prices. Political instability? Excellent for business. A change in government. Merely a renegotiation of existing contracts, a realignment of stakeholders, sometimes even an aggressive rebranding campaign. The underlying enterprise rarely falters. Its human capital management is equally fascinating. Employees are recruited not through merit or open competition, but through networks of loyalty, kinship, or shared culpability. Performance metrics are simple. How much can you extract? How discreetly can you do it? And how effectively can you protect the network? Promotions are often granted based on demonstrated capacity for both ruthlessness and discretion. Loyalty is paramount, enforced not by HR policies, but by mutually assured destruction. Consider the market entry barriers. For an honest individual, entering a system steeped in corruption can be a monumental challenge. The cost of doing business includes compromising one's integrity, navigating complex unwritten rules, and facing severe repercussions if caught or if the internal codes are violated. For those already inside, these same barriers protect their turf, ensuring a stable, often monopolistic, control over their particular segment of the market. It's a closed shop, a cartel operating under the guise of public administration. The return on investment for a corrupt official or enterprise can be astronomical. A small initial bribe can unlock a multi-million-dollar contract, a lifetime of influence, or immunity from prosecution. The risks are, of course, significant, but the rewards often outweigh them, particularly in jurisdictions where the rule of law is weak or selectively applied. This calculated risk-reward analysis is at the heart of every decision made within this illicit marketplace. It's a high-stakes game of corporate strategy, played with the resources and future of entire populations. But how exactly does this sprawling, intricate web of transactions and influence begin its insidious crawl? What are the foundational building blocks, the initial investments required to establish such a robust, self-sustaining economic model of crime? And what makes certain markets more fertile ground than others for this particular brand of enterprise? The insidious crawl rarely begins with a grand orchestrated heist. Instead, it often starts with a single seemingly trivial concession, a minor bending of the rules for a friend, a family member, or a strategically placed favor. Think of it as venture capital for illicit enterprise. A small, often untraceable, investment of compromised integrity. This initial seed funding buys goodwill, creates an obligation, and, most crucially, identifies a weak point in the system's ethical firewall. These foundational building blocks are not bricks and mortar, but whispers and handshake deals. They are built on a perverse form of trust, where shared secrets and mutual vulnerability forge bonds stronger than any legal contract. Each small favor granted, each minor regulation bypassed, chips away at the institutional safeguards, paving the way for larger, more brazen operations. It's an incremental acquisition strategy, slowly taking control of public functions, one compromised official at a time. Certain markets, or rather, certain nations, possess a unique blend of ingredients that make them exceptionally fertile ground for this particular brand of enterprise. Consider places where institutional oversight is a mere suggestion, where the judicial system operates on a sliding scale of influence, or where economic disparities are so vast that a bribe represents not just profit, but survival. These are the prime targets for market penetration, locations where the existing infrastructure is ripe for a hostile takeover. The core product traded in this enterprise is access. Access to lucrative government contracts that were never truly competitive. Access to natural resources, granted with a wink and a nod, bypassing environmental safeguards and local community rights. Access to judicial leniency or, conversely, to targeted persecution, turning the justice system into a weapon for hire. This access isn't a one-time sale. It's a subscription model, requiring continuous payments, ensuring a steady revenue stream for the network. It's a sophisticated market, operating under the radar, yet dictating the real economic flow of entire regions. The hostile takeover aspect is critical, a corporate raid not on a company, but on the very foundations of public trust. It's not about buying shares, it's about subverting the ostensible purpose of public office, twisting it into a private profit center. Power in this shadow economy becomes the ultimate product, aggressively marketed and strategically deployed. Access to critical decision-making, control over vast public resources, the unilateral ability to grant or deny permits, or even to manipulate the scales of justice. These are the high-value commodities traded in this dark marketplace. The currency of compromise is rarely just cold, hard cash. It's far more insidious. It might be the intimate knowledge of a past transgression, a meticulously crafted promise of future protection from legal scrutiny, or the chilling threat of exposure that could dismantle a career and a life. Every minor transaction, every brazenly bypassed regulation deepens the entanglement, creating a web of mutual culpability that makes disentanglement not just difficult, but potentially suicidal for those involved. It's a system designed to self-perpetuate, binding its participants with invisible chains of shared secrets and illicit gains. Once these foundational compromises are in place, the system rapidly expands its supply chains and distribution networks, often mirroring the legitimate bureaucracy it has infiltrated. The unwritten surcharge, That shadow tax on every public transaction, every vital license, and every lucrative government bid ceases to be an anomaly and becomes a normalized, expected operating cost. It is meticulously baked into the very fabric of doing business within that compromised ecosystem, a non-negotiable premium for access. An official government budget might publicly state one figure, but the true cost, including this ubiquitous shadow premium, tells a profoundly different and far more expensive story. This is precisely how a parallel economic system emerges. A colossal shadow GDP that siphons trillions annually from the public purse, diverting wealth meant for collective progress into private coffers. This illicit economy, honed and perfected over centuries in specific corners of the world, demonstrates remarkable and unsettling resilience. It doesn't just survive crises, it actively thrives on them. Political instability, natural disasters, economic downturns, these are not obstacles, but merely new market opportunities, moments of heightened vulnerability to be exploited. The ensuing chaos provides perfect cover, diverts critical attention, and creates new, desperate avenues for illicit extraction. While the legitimate economy struggles to recover, the shadow economy adapts with predatory efficiency, often expanding its reach by offering solutions that bypass conventional, slow, or broken systems, further cementing its indispensability in the eyes of desperate stakeholders. It is, undeniably, a masterclass in opportunistic capitalism, but one that extracts its profits from the very soul of a nation. This relentless extraction, where trillions of dollars are siphoned off annually, represents a colossal hemorrhage of potential. These funds, desperately needed for schools, hospitals, roads, and legitimate economic development, never re-enter the productive investment cycle. Instead, they vanish into a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and ostentatious luxury assets, fueling a global economy of illicit wealth. The consequence is a perpetual underdevelopment, a deepening of poverty, and a widening chasm of inequality that becomes almost impossible to bridge. Entire nations find their progress stunted, their citizens robbed of opportunities, all to sustain this sophisticated, self-serving enterprise. It's a tragic testament to a business model that prioritizes private gain above all else, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and stunted futures. But this intricate, often brutal dance between extraction and survival raises a critical question. How do the architects of this deeply entrenched system manage to maintain control, to prevent internal feuds, and ultimately, to keep the entire operation from collapsing under its own immense weight, especially when the lines between legitimate power, public service, and illicit enterprise blur into an utterly unrecognizable, dangerous mess? The answer, predictably, is not found in transparency or accountability. It resides in a meticulously crafted web of mutual dependence, a corporate structure built not on trust, but on shared guilt and an unbreakable chain of obligation. Every participant, from the lowest level fixer to the highest ranking official, holds a piece of leverage over another, creating a self-reinforcing ecosystem where defection is not just risky, but virtually impossible. The currency, as we've established, isn't merely cash. It's the indelible stain of complicity, the knowledge of secrets too explosive to ever be revealed. This isn't merely about individual acts of corruption. It's about institutionalizing a perverse form of corporate governance. The HR department of this shadow enterprise operates on a simple principle. Everyone must be compromised. Everyone must have something to lose. Promotions are not based on merit, but on proven loyalty and a demonstrable willingness to cross ethical lines. Training involves not just learning the ropes of illicit transactions, but also accumulating enough incriminating evidence against peers and superiors to ensure a constant state of mutual vulnerability. This creates an unwritten code of silence, a powerful incentive to maintain the status quo, because exposing one means risking the exposure of all. It's a system designed to ensure collective survival through collective guilt. This intricate system, perfected over centuries in specific corners of the world, functions with the brutal efficiency of a perfectly optimized supply chain. The product, access to contracts, to resources, to justice, or perhaps more accurately, to the strategic lack of justice, moves seamlessly from its point of origin to its final consumer. A government contract destined for a public tender is rerouted through a series of shell companies, each adding its own administrative fee, a euphemism for the unwritten surcharge that greases the wheels of this shadow GDP. The initial bribe, the seed capital, blossoms into a cascade of illicit payments, each one binding more individuals into the network with threads of both profit and fear. Consider the distribution network for this access. It's not just a single powerful figure operating in isolation. It's a distributed ledger of favors owed, information traded, and vulnerabilities meticulously catalogued, often spanning decades. A judge might owe a politician a past favor for a lenient ruling on a relative. That politician, in turn, might need a businessman's dark money for a campaign that would otherwise fail. The businessman naturally expects a tangible return. A strategically timed zoning permit for a prime piece of land, an exclusive license to exploit a national resource, or perhaps even a crucial tip-off about a competitor's impending bankruptcy. This isn't a simple one-off transaction. It's a multi-layered, intergenerational investment in a system designed to circumvent every legitimate safeguard. The insidious beauty from a purely cynical perspective lies in its modularity and redundancy. If one link in this chain of complicity weakens or fails, another is quickly forged, often through intimidation or the promise of even greater illicit gains. This hostile takeover of legitimate institutions isn't a sudden dramatic coup. It's a slow, insidious erosion from within, much like a virulent parasite gradually consuming its host from the inside out. Power, the ultimate product in this market, is incrementally acquired by compromising individuals, one by one, until entire departments, ministries, even the highest echelons of the state become de facto subsidiaries of the shadow corporation. Public service, once a noble calling, morphs into a cynical front for private enrichment, its original purpose hollowed out, leaving only the hollow facade of governance. The very laws designed to protect citizens, to ensure fairness and equity, are twisted into sophisticated tools for exploitation, becoming another commodity to be bought, sold, or strategically ignored depending on the price and the influence wielded by the highest bidder. It's a complete inversion of public trust, where the guardians become the predators. And what of the immense weight of this operation? Why doesn't it collapse under its own immense, unethical load, a structure built on lies and stolen futures? Because it has become too big to fail, too intricately intertwined with the legitimate economy, too deeply rooted in the very fabric of nations. Its resilience is its most terrifying feature, a testament to its perverse adaptability. When economic crises hit, when political instability rocks a nation, the shadow economy doesn't falter. It expands with predatory vigor, like a scavenger thriving on the carrion of collapse. It offers a parallel, albeit illicit, form of governance, promising quick, decisive solutions where legitimate systems are bogged down by bureaucracy, paralyzed by infighting, or simply too slow to react to urgent needs. It becomes the de facto, albeit unacknowledged, problem solver for desperate stakeholders, further entrenching its necessity in the minds of those who benefit or merely survive within its dark embrace. This brutal adaptability, this ability to thrive in chaos, makes it a truly formidable, almost immortal entity. A hydra that grows stronger with every head chopped off. But this grand cynical enterprise, for all its sophisticated design and centuries-long refinement, for all its terrifying resilience, faces an immutable challenge inherent to any organization built on such a precarious foundation. The very architects of this system, those who expertly pull the strings from the shadows, are bound by a shared guilt that is also their greatest weakness. What happens when the immense pressure of their collective crimes, the constant threat of exposure, begins to fracture their alliances? What occurs when mutual distrust starts to outweigh shared profit, and the carefully balanced scales of power, once so stable, begin to tip violently, threatening to expose the entire meticulously constructed operation to the blinding, unforgiving light of day? The corporate structure might be robust, but its leadership is still human, driven by greed and fear, and prone to the fatal flaw of all empires: internal strife. It began, as most corporate takeovers do, with a quiet shift in allegiance. A key distributor, once loyal to the Northern Syndicate's access routes for lucrative government infrastructure contracts, suddenly rerouted his entire network. Billions in unwritten surcharges, the very lifeblood of the shadow PIB, were suddenly flowing elsewhere into accounts far removed from the usual quarterly reports. This wasn't a mere market fluctuation, it was a declaration of war, a hostile acquisition of territory previously considered inviolable. The product, access to those coveted contracts, was still being sold, but the commission structure had been brutally renegotiated without a single boardroom vote. The old guard, accustomed to the centuries-long refinement of the system, found their carefully balanced scales tipping, not subtly, but violently, with the weight of audacious betrayal. The immediate fallout was not a moral reckoning, of course, but a frantic audit of the system's vulnerabilities. Every compromised official, every laundered dollar, every unspoken favor suddenly felt like a ticking liability. The collective guilt, once a binding agent, now became a corrosive acid. Whispers turned to accusations. The very resilience of the system, its ability to thrive in chaos, was now being tested by chaos from within. This wasn't an external crisis that could be exploited. This was a self-inflicted wound, bleeding profits and trust simultaneously. At the heart of the conflict lay a single monolithic prize: the nation's new energy grid initiative, a project slated to siphon trillions into the legitimate economy, and by extension, an even larger, unrecorded percentage into the shadow. Access to its contracts, its raw materials, its regulatory approvals meant generational wealth. The syndicate that controlled this pipeline would effectively control a significant chunk of the national GDP, both visible and invisible. This was the ultimate hostile takeover, not of a company, but of a nation's future, orchestrated from within its own dark underbelly. The usual channels of negotiation, the subtle threats and veiled promises that lubricated this parallel economy, evaporated. Instead, messages were delivered through intermediaries with bruised knuckles, coded warnings whispered over untraceable burners. The sophisticated supply chains, designed for discretion, now became conduits for intimidation. The product of access was being weaponized. If you couldn't guarantee safe passage for a bribe, you became a liability. If you couldn't ensure the quiet approval of a judge, your value plummeted. Fear, the silent partner in every illicit venture, began to dominate boardrooms that never officially existed. The fear of being cut out, of being exposed, of becoming the sacrificial lamb when the entire operation inevitably began to unravel. Greed, however, was the primary driver, a siren call promising absolute dominion. One faction, emboldened by its initial coup, sought to centralize all access points, to monopolize the justice, or lack thereof, system, effectively turning the entire shadow economy into a single vertically integrated criminal trust. This move, if successful, would rewrite the centuries-old rules of engagement, eliminating competition and consolidating power in a way previously unimaginable. The response was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable for an organization built on such a precarious foundation. The unwritten surcharge on a crucial mining permit for the energy grid project, typically a smooth transaction, was suddenly blocked, not by external authorities, but by an internal counter-move. Key political figures, whose loyalty was bought with compromise in currency, found their accounts frozen, their past indiscretions suddenly leaked to obscure but influential online forums. This was not a plea for negotiation, it was a surgical strike, designed to amputate the rebellious factions' financial arteries, to remind them that while they might control a distribution network, the old guard still held the keys to the central bank of corruption. The carefully constructed edifice, this global shadow PIB, began to crack under the strain of its own ambition. The billions diverted annually, once a symbol of shared prosperity for a select few, now became the very fuel for their mutual destruction. The system, so resilient against external threats, was proving tragically fragile from within. The question was no longer if it would collapse, but who would be left standing when the dust settled, and what fragments of the legitimate economy they would drag down with them. The next move would decide everything, a final, desperate gamble that threatened to expose every intricate detail, every name, every transaction, to the blinding, unforgiving light of day. A single encrypted message pinged across a secure network, containing only one word, a command that would either restore order or ignite an inferno. Execute. The command, execute, was not a directive for violence, but for a meticulously planned financial counter-offensive. Within hours, the rebellious faction found their offshore accounts not just frozen, but systematically emptied. Their network of shell corporations, once a labyrinth of protection, became a transparent ledger for the old guard. The data leaks intensified, not targeting political figures, but the very infrastructure of their illicit businesses. Supply routes compromised, unwritten surcharges bypassed by a parallel, equally corrupt but loyal network. This wasn't a war of ethics, but of market share in the shadow economy. The lesson was brutal. While innovation was tolerated, a complete hostile takeover of the entire criminal trust was an existential threat. The system, perfected over centuries, had built-in antibodies against such internal insurrections. It could absorb external shocks, political upheavals, and even global pandemics, but it would not tolerate a challenge to its fundamental structure of distributed, albeit illicit, power. The trillions of dollars diverted annually, the very lifeblood of this shadow PIB, were now being redirected, not to productive investments for society, but to fortify the existing power brokers. The dust settled not with a collapse, but with a reassertion of the established order. The access to contracts, resources, and selective justice remained the core product, but the distribution channels were once again firmly under the control of those who understood its centuries-old rules. The incident served as a stark internal audit, demonstrating the system's terrifying resilience. It thrives on crises, on instability, and perhaps, most ironically, on the very internal conflicts that expose its intricate workings. The global economy continues to pay its unwritten surcharge, funding a parallel enterprise that simply refuses to die, perpetually evolving, perpetually adapting. It forces us to ask, if this sophisticated network can survive its own civil wars, what does that say about our ability to ever truly dismantle it? What new form of access will they monetize next?